This session, it's the last, and we often say the last but not least, but I suppose in relation to this particular topic, we could arguably say it's one of the most important topics for the future of our planet, because we're discussing climate change, and in particular the relationship between the climate change and the financial services sector. We're going to open today's session with a keynote address from Professor Peter Thorne, who is the Professor in Physical Geography and the Director of the ICARUS Climate Research Centre at Maynooth University. And he's going to set the scene for us by outlining the reality of climate change and the challenges that we are facing as a humanity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to give you slides here that are exclusively from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and more pertinently from the summaries for policymakers, which means they have been approved by every government in the world, word for word or figure by figure. So hopefully this clicker will work. Is it turned on? Do I have to point it there? If not, let's go next. Okay, so we're using next the verbal way. That's fine. We're grand? Okay, so first thing to note is that we are definitely warming the world in a way that is very, very unusual. Here is the last 2,000 years worth of temperature reconstruction from various proxy sources and the observations on the end. We are warming the world in a way that is very, very highly unusual. On the left-hand side is a little bar. That bar is the warmest period in the current interglacial, the last 10,000 years, the period in which we have gone from hunter-gatherers through an agrarian and industrial and a technological revolution. The eagle-eyed amongst you will see that we are now above that bar. So we are in uncharted waters in terms of modern human civilization, in terms of the climate. We have left the safe operating space. Next, please. And that means what? Why is that? Well, if we can run complex numerical simulations on very, very big computers, and we can run those with different assumptions as to what might have caused the change. The green ones here are those with only changes in solar and volcanic outputs. Nothing more, nothing less. And the brown one is the runs where we add humans, our emissions principally through the burning of fossil fuels. And surprise, surprise, we cannot explain the climate changes we've seen without human influence. It works. Okay, so a major innovation since the last assessment report has been in the attribution of extreme events. Extreme heat, we are seeing more and more extreme heat, and we have high confidence that that extreme heat is being made more likely, more frequent, more extreme due to human influence. We also have the same for heavy precipitation. We are fundamentally altering not just the mean climate, but the extremes of the climate that matter to us in our day-to-day lives. Now I'm going to go all matrix on you here. We've got red pills and we've got blue pills. The red pills, the SSPs as they're called, are scenarios in which we continue to build emissions of carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide through much of the balance of this century. They are plausible choices we could make as civilization. We could equally plausibly make the blue choices here. These are choices that reach net zero carbon dioxide emissions by the middle of the century and go net negative thereafter. They halve methane emissions by about 2050 and continue to reduce them. They also reduce emissions of nitrous oxide. Now, why am I saying red pill, blue pill? Well, if we look at how this transfers, and the colors are exactly the same here, into global surface temperature, if we take the blue pill, we can stabilize climate within the lifetime of today's junior infants. That doesn't mean that climate returns to where we are today, or even better, pre-industrial. It means we stop doing more harm to the climate system. And actually, if you look, both of these blue lines is trending ever so slightly downwards at the end of the century. If we continue to emit, if we take the red pills, we are still increasing temperature, and we've blasted through 3, 4 degrees centigrade. We can't rule out having blasted through 5 degrees centigrade. This is the stark reality of the choices before us as human civilization. Global mean is not what we experience locally. Anywhere in the world, the continents are warming more than the oceans. The Arctic is warming fastest of all. At the top is just a confirmation that these simulations with these complex computers really are plausible. On the left is what we've observed to date at 1 degree of warming. On the right is what the simulations show at 1 degree of warming. They're very, very close. And then at the bottom, you see what would happen if we went to 1.5, or 2, or 4. And you see that the patterns fundamentally continue to just get worse and worse. And you can look at the same thing in precipitation. Exactly the same thing happens. Regions that dry at 1.5 degrees dry yet more at 2, and dry even more at 4 degrees centigrade. So the climate we're already experiencing, the climate change we're already experiencing is important for things to come. The things we already experience in an island, like increasing preponderance of heat waves and heavy precipitation events, are important for what's to come if we continue to emit greenhouse gases. And it's not just geophysical things that respond with that kind of pattern. This is biodiversity loss from the Working Group 2 report at 1.5 and 3 degrees centigrade. At 1.5 degrees, we lose over much of the world, less than a quarter of the biodiversity. If we go to 3 degrees, most of the world has lost about half of its biodiversity at a fundamental level. And you see biodiversity hotspots that are already appearing, and those biodiversity hotspots will spread and get worse the more we warm. So it's not just a climate crisis, it's a biodiversity crisis. Climate is one player in that biodiversity crisis, not the sole player. And what we will see is more and more extremes, and those extremes become more frequent and more severe with climate change. So what was in pre-industrial climate once a decade heat event is already occurring roughly 3 times a decade today. When we get to 1.5 degrees, which we'll probably get to in about 2030 or so, it will be 4 times as likely. If we were silly enough to go to 4 degrees, it would become an annual type of event. And then you go to the even rarer event, the 50-year events, those odds get even worse. So we are making the climate more severe the more we warm the climate system. For the heat and also precipitation and other extremes become more likely, more intense with every degree of warming. There are also, it is important to stress, elements of the climate system that clearly will not scale, will not stop. As I said earlier, within the lifetime of today's junior infants, we can stop the warming of the globe. We can stabilize things like precipitation, but we have set in chain already through our actions processes that will take 2 to 10,000 years to play out with sea level. The oceans take so long to respond. The ice sheets take so long to respond. So we're committing to multi-generational change in our coastline and here in Ireland. The sole question is how much. And if we continue to emit very strongly, we cannot rule out very fast sea level change. Where we might end up, if we end up at about 1.5 degrees, is probably somewhere between 5 and 10 meters of sea level rise. If we end up at carbon dioxide levels similar to today, in the long term, then we're looking at 5 to 25 meters of sea level. That's not the sea level that you or I will experience. We will experience centimeters, but it is what we are committing multiple generations hence to deal with if we do not get our act together. We have fundamentally new understandings, improved understanding of climate-related risks. And climate-related risks is fundamentally a combination of hazard, vulnerability, and exposure. So when you think about how we can adapt to climate change, we can't affect the climate hazard part. That's mitigation. Adaptation is about reducing vulnerability and exposure. What investment decisions can we make that reduce vulnerability and exposure, that make us more resilient to a changing climate? So there's this interaction between climate change, human society, and biodiversity that is hugely complicated that we need to understand. And we need to understand that we can't say, well, I'm all right, Jack. We are a nice Northern Hemisphere, mid-latitude, ocean-bound island. Directly, we are not going to be the most affected place on the globe by a very, very long shot. There's no two ways around that. But we live in a global interconnected system. Things that happen in countries far away can cascade through to us geopolitically and economically very, very quickly. So we need to understand compound risks. You'll hear this winter a lot about food price inflation. I hope that that reporting is not solely about Ukraine crisis and the illegal invasion of Ukraine, because we have had major climate impacts this summer simultaneously on every major bread basket region of the world. So absent Ukraine, we would still have a challenge with food. The challenge for us is prices. The challenge, of course, for the developing world is going to be access to food. And that comes to this inequity and inequality aspect of climate change. So every ton we emit of carbon dioxide adds to global warming. This is not time along the bottom, along the horizontal. This is cumulative emissions of carbon dioxide. On the vertical is temperature change. In the black line is the observations. And you see over the past 170 years, temperature has basically changed almost linearly with cumulative carbon dioxide emissions, and we can expect that to continue. So if we take those nice blue pills, we can stop warming relatively low levels, but it means stopping emissions very, very fast. And we're fundamentally not on track to limit warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade. We haven't even slowed down, let alone taken a junction off the highway and turned around and gone back the other way yet. So we are still fundamentally heading the wrong way. These are the emissions of different greenhouse gases. We are about 54% higher in 2019 than in 1990. We've known climate change is a problem for even longer than this. But internationally, we've had negotiations since 1990. They've clearly been massively successful because we're emitting 54% more than when they started. And this is what it looks like if we move forwards in terms of the emissions of greenhouse gases through 2050. So to limit warming to 1.5 degrees with no or limited overshoot, we'd have to follow the blue path. We're currently following the red path. That's the implemented policies globally. We'd have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in totality by 43%. Methane would have to be reduced by 34% by 2030. To limit warming to 2 degrees centigrade, we'd have to reduce by 27% by 2030. In all cases, we need to stop that upward trend and start going down very, very quickly to keep a chance of keeping below 2 degrees. And the good news is there are options available now in every sector that can at least halve emissions by 2030. Technologically, it's absolutely possible. There are solutions in existence in every single sector that can get us to at least halve our global greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. That's across demand and services, energy, land use, industry, urban buildings, transport. All these sectors, we have solutions to hand. And in some cases, they're being adopted, mainly because they're financially competitive. So the grey band here is the 2019 levelized cost of fossil fuels. And the blue curves are photovoltaics and onshore wind. And they are now at the point where they are cheaper in terms of levelized costs than greenhouse gas infrastructure for power generation. And that's from 2019 fossil fuel prices. Imagine what this graph would look like today, because the grey band would be about 2 or 3 times as high up the graph. So there is a massive win in investing in renewable technologies. Looking at things like batteries also have massively decreased. So we have price opportunity, we have price equality, if not price preference for renewables and for storage increasingly in our energy. And as a result, electricity uptake of these is large, but it's nowhere near enough. We're still only at 3–6% of electricity from photovoltaics and onshore wind, respectively. We're a long way globally from the renewable revolution that we need, and battery electric vehicles are even further behind. But there are shining lights where we are very, very far along the way. Now this, I don't expect you to take a huge amount away from. This is a key figure to me in the IPCC Working Group 3 summary for policymakers. Don't read all the lines, but what you need to understand is that the blue parts of this graph are parts where it's actually cheaper in levelized cost terms out to 2030 to do that than to persist with what we do today. Absent of any price. The yellow and the orange parts of this are less than 20 and less than $50 per ton of CO2. Bear in mind that ETS and our carbon tax mean that those yellow and orange effectively are cheaper for us in Ireland, given our policy framework. You're talking 4 gigatons of CO2 from wind energy, you're talking 4 and a bit from solar energy. Huge number of opportunities at relatively low levelized costs out to 2030 to effect change across all sectors. But some sectors are much harder. It must be understood that not all sectors are equal here. But we have enormous opportunities to effect change across the system, and opportunities that might actually return on the investment very quickly before 2030. So I'm going to finish with some quotes initially from the Working Group 3 on finance. We're not meeting the Paris Agreement 100 billion per year in climate finance. We're still financing fossil fuels, and actually we're financing them much more than we are climate action. We're still financing and subsidizing the harm much more than we are the response and the cure. We need to broaden access. We need to enable everyone to partake in this revolution if it is to be successful. That's what the third says. We need to accelerate international cooperation in finance. We need to recognize and respond to the barriers in finance which arise from inadequate assessments, regional mismatches, propensity to think about home, your country. Vulnerability, institutional capabilities. That's why I'm so glad to see the central bank here having a climate unit and taking seriously this aspect. It is one of the blocks that needs to be unblocked, just one. We're way behind where we need in terms of finance. We're 3 to 6 times globally behind where we need to be in terms of investment if we are to follow pathways consistent with limiting warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees centigrade. We need to up our game very, very considerably. The good news is that it's about political will. There is sufficient liquidity in the global financial system to undertake that investment. It's a question of value, judgment, and choice. And I said earlier at the start, every word in this is going to be from the approved language. This is approved word by every government in the world. So you have the governments of Brazil, Saudi Arabia, USA, Australia, United Arab Emirates. They've all signed up to this statement. The cumulative scientific evidence is unequivocal. Climate change is a threat to human well-being and planetary health. Any further delay in concerted, anticipatory global action on adaptation and mitigation will miss a brief and rapidly closing window of opportunity to secure a livable and sustainable future for all. That's not me saying that. That's the end of a huge deliberative process signed off and agreed word by all of the governments of the world participating in the IPCC process. Be in no doubt, we must act. So the evidence is clear, the time for action is now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Thorne. That was quite a stark presentation, actually, and sets us up very nicely for the next session, the panel session now. Let me just introduce you to the members of this particular panel. Firstly, we're joined by our chair, our Deputy Governor of Monetary Policy and Financial Stability, Vasileios Madouros. And the panel also includes, apart from Professor Thorne, Dawn Slevin, who is the Managing Director of Environmental Liability Solutions Limited. She has over 28 years' experience as a market-leading consultant on sustainability issues, among other things. But importantly, Dawn was also co-chair of the EU Commission's technical expert group that worked on the EU taxonomy, and is also recently endorsed as chair for work with EFRAG as part of the European framework. We also are joined by Thierry, Philipponnat, Chief Economist at Finance Watch. Thierry has a broad experience in many different roles across banking and market infrastructure and the NGO sector, but in particular he has quite a broad recent experience looking at across the board at sustainability and finance related issues. And finally, on this particular stage, we're joined by Stephen Nolan, who's the Managing Director and Head of Secretariat at the UNDP Financial Centres for Sustainability and the Sustainable Insurance Forum. And Stephen is also a member of several international sustainable finance committees, and he chairs the annual Climate Finance Week Ireland series that took place just 2 weeks ago. And finally, we're very glad to welcome on our virtual stage Elizabeth McCaul. I hope you can hear us okay, Elizabeth. Elizabeth is a member of the Supervisory Board of the European Central Bank, and she has also a very broad range of executive responsibilities covering many different issues across the supervision agenda, digital finance and all that goes with that. But she also has a very vast experience outside the SSM, having held many senior roles in investment banking, consulting and the US state banking. So welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for your time here. Very excited about the conversation and discussion we're going to have. And just to remind you again to our audience, the virtual audience, to input your questions through WebEx chat function, and I'll hand it to you. Thank you, Val.
Thank you very much, Yvonne, for the introductions of our panel. Also, I know it's a theme that's very close to your own heart as a head of our climate change unit at the Central Bank. Let me also start by welcoming our panel members. Thank you very much, all of you, for joining us here today. Thank you also, Elizabeth, for joining us virtually. I hope the technology is working. I understand you're in New York, so also thank you for making the time early for you. As Yvonne mentioned, this is our last panel session for this conference, and we certainly saved the most challenging topic for last, because over the next hour or so, we want to discuss climate change and sustainable finance, and how we collectively move from words to actions to concrete outcomes. Now, we had a call with the panel members to prep for the session, and we all agreed that there's absolutely no chance that we'll cover this fully in an hour and 15 minutes, but we'll try and pack as much in. And with that in mind, let me just start by giving a little bit of context, but I'll keep it short. Actually, Peter's excellent remarks, for which thank you very much, have set the scene very, very well, serving as a stark reminder, if one was needed, of both the detrimental effects of climate change and the urgent need for action. Of course, tackling climate change will be everyone's responsibility, and naturally, elected governments will lead the way by setting the pace towards net zero. But all of us will have to adjust. And within that, finance and the financial sector have a particularly key role to play. Because as the governor mentioned in his introductory remarks yesterday, finance is a core infrastructure of modern economies and the modern societies. So it's intrinsically linked to these big societal transitions. And there is no greater transition for humanity than the necessary adjustment to net zero, which will be a structural transformation for our economies and for our societies. Finance will be at the heart of many of these adjustments, both because climate change and the transition to net zero will pose risks to the financial system, but also because at the same time, and as Peter was saying, the financial system will be core to financing that transition. Now, taking a step back, we have been moving at least in the right direction, if not in terms of magnitude. So, if you think about where we were 15 or 20 years ago, few in the financial industry would have been actively considering how they could best support the allocation of capital to support the transition. And it would have been an even rarer occurrence to hear central banks and regulators talk about climate change. Fast forward to where we are now, and it's evident that there's been a clear shift in the priority that's attached to climate change and sustainable finance across the financial system. Central banks, regulators, financial services industry itself, and crucially, consumers of financial services. Now, while the direction has been positive, there is no question that we have much further to travel, and that we need to approach this both with a sense of urgency and also with a clear focus on the outcomes that we're trying to achieve. Because at the end of the day, taking the necessary actions to ensure that the financial system is both resilient to climate-related risks and supports the transition to net zero is the single most important contribution that this generation of finance leaders can make to combating climate change. So, really delighted to be joined by this excellent panel today. The way we're going to do it is similar to the other one, so each of our panel members is going to give us some initial reflections, and then we'll try and cover some themes, both related to where we are on the journey and how we tackled some of the challenges ahead. And we'll try to make it interactive, taking questions from people in the room, but also in the audience virtually. So why don't we kick off? Don, perhaps I can start with you.
Sure.
Maybe with a kind of 30,000 feet perspective. So I think it was a few years ago that Mark Carney said, or described climate change as the tragedy of the horizon, because the impacts are felt way beyond the traditional horizons of most decision makers now. So from your perspective, how are we doing in breaking that tragedy? How are we doing in terms of ensuring that the financial system prioritizes and responds to climate change? And I guess within that, what are the respective roles of governments, central banks, regulators, and the industry itself?
Thank you, Vaz. Small question. I would like to start about Europe, because I'd like to talk about Europe's journey first, and then, of course, refer to the global situation. In terms of the financial strategy, we started in 2018 with the Sustainable Finance Action Plan, which was a seminal plan to shift capital into truly sustainable activities. And number one on that agenda was the development of the EU taxonomy. And this was and is a tool for the financial sector and real economy sectors to evaluate economic activities that are making change. So this first step, and it's been progressing, and Commissioner McGuinness spoke about it earlier this morning, it showed a real commitment from DG FISMA and, of course, all of the other Directorate Generals in the EU, because we had published also a Clean Planet for All, which set out strategies for transport, for energy, for agriculture, and so on, and construction and real estate. So Europe has been aiming to tackle this from policy and regulatory and tool-based decision-making for quite a while now. And we're now getting to the point that this is being implemented. And Europe is successfully decoupling our emissions from our activities within Europe. On the global stage, this is different again, and I'm not saying Europe isn't contributing to a global problem. We have products that we bring in from external countries. We have in Ireland alone 4 trillion in investments from domiciled Irish companies. Do we know what we're supporting with those investments globally? So the global international issue is an issue for all of us. And very worryingly, the UN issued a report last week saying that we're nowhere near achieving our 1.5 degree threshold set, because we have now record levels of methane, nitrous oxide and carbon dioxide. So we aren't achieving. That graph that Peter showed us is still happening. We haven't leveled off, we haven't plateaued. So really it is a requirement for all of us to respond to that. And in that context, our governments, of course, play a key role, because governments are responsible for national strategies, for transport, for low carbon transport, for our agriculture, our key carbon sequestering activity, very important, for our construction and real estate sectors and so on and so forth, our energy sector, particularly developing a grid so that we can, rather than store electricity, which is still, a challenge in storing energy, that we can distribute it widely across Europe very quickly so that we can make balanced decisions around energy. So there's a lot governments can do, and not least around the Sustainable Finance Strategy, which is implementing the different directives that have come through, the Transparency Directive, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, and the standards that are being developed under that, and also helping the financial sector understand tools such as the EU taxonomy and how to apply them. And then, of course, the central bank, with a monetary and financial stability role, plays a key role on risk-based assessment. In particular, when I mentioned the taxonomy, we have a whole annex on climate change adaptation. So giving the financial sector entities the guidance and additional tools to help them understand their scenarios and undertake risk-based assessments is going to be very important, as well as monitoring and ensuring the capital flows are going where they're intended to, and sampling, doing intensive sampling of the different products, the financial products, to see how they're doing doing and where the weak points are in order to talk to the financial sector and the real economy from the government's point of view to find solutions. I'm not suggesting this is a sanctions-based monitoring. It's a collaborative effort because that's what we need. And the financial sector, I think anyone from the financial sector already knows the requirements they have in terms of bringing the regulations into their organizations, embedding sustainability as a core pillar, developing their business model to bring that in if they haven't already done so, and many have, and then complying with the transparency rules from the EU taxonomy if they're a public interest entity, the new rules that are coming in on the CSRD, and also the SFDR, the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, which has already been brought in a progressive manner. So there's a lot for the financial sector to do, but most importantly is to understand where the capital is flowing, where you're investing, the types of products you're making, and how they've been designed in order to support a circular economy so that all of your stakeholders can benefit for the choices you make in the design of your products, and ultimately your consumers, that they understand as a pension holder where their monies are going, etc.
Thanks very much, Don, and I'm sure we'll cover some of these issues, including the one around how do we monitor that capital is going to the right places. Maybe, Thierry, I could turn to you next. One of the dimensions here that is that it's widely accepted that climate change can pose financial risks to the financial sector. So how does our collective thinking need to evolve and mature as we're thinking about identifying, measuring, and managing climate-related risks?
Thank you very much. Great question. I think our collective thinking can evolve and must evolve by linking science, what Peter summarized brilliantly as an introduction to this panel, understanding how the financial system functions, and the impact on society and on humanity in general. Let me take a very concrete example. The then CEO of AXA, which is one of the biggest insurance companies in the world, Henri de Castres, said in 2015 that he, as the CEO of AXA, did not know how to insure a world at +4 degrees. It's not me saying it, it's the CEO of one of the largest insurance companies in the world. Then I open the IPCC report, and I see that the probability that we're going to hit a world at +4 degrees is, Peter, correct me if I'm wrong, but in the 60%, 70% range, depending on the scenarios. And of course, it's not, but likelihood of the world going to +4 degrees is high. That's horrendous, but it's the reality. And then you link that to the way the economy and the world functions. None of us has invented a world without insurance. We need insurance, because if you don't have insurance, you don't have financing. A banker will not lend to a company if that company is not insured, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So no insurance, no finance, no economy, everything collapses. What I'm saying here is that very often, and rightly so, we talk about transition risk and physical risk when it comes to climate change. And this is perfectly valid. I mean, I'm not at all challenging this analysis. But I think there's a bigger risk that we always skip, which is disruption risk. And disruption risk is really what we saw at the very beginning of the COVID crisis, where the economy is hit. And when the economy is hit, you have a big financial problem. And how did we solve that? I'm not going into this discussion now. In March 2020, basically massive central bank intervention to support the financial system so that it doesn't collapse. End of discussion on this particular topic. But what I'm saying here is that we have a huge disruption risk. The source of everything is obviously fossil fuels, which is the source of the bulk of CO2 emissions, or CO2 emissions. That's CO2 equivalent. We have prudential regulation that says that if a risk is deemed particularly high, that risk should receive, whether in banking prudential regulation or insurance prudential regulation, a particular treatment. We collectively as this system face a paradox. And the paradox is that we're used to quantifying first, then draw conclusions from what we've quantified. And once we've done that, we say, okay, I've seen it, I understand. Then central bankers, legislators, regulators in general will say, okay, now I understand, and then I decide that we do this, we do that. In the case of climate change, we don't have the possibility of doing that, because it's not that I often hear that we have data gaps. It's not that we have data gaps. We don't have the data, and when we have the data, it will be too late. So how do we act? We need to think together how we can act differently. And in my view, the way we can act differently is really to exert our judgment, use a qualitative thinking when you cannot quantify. Let me give you a very simple example. Stranded assets. As we know, stranded assets is the fact that there is no scenario under which the value of fossil fuel reserves can prosper if you take perspective of 30, 50, 80 years. Why is that? Either governments everywhere in the world, it's not this government, this country or that country, everywhere in the world, will make the right decision to keep fossil fuel under the ground, in which case the value of those reserves will falter by definition, or they will not make the decisions, and the world will go to +4, +5 degrees, and everything collapses. So in either cases, the value of fossil fuel reserves is doomed. Okay. As financiers, I was a banker for 20 years. As a financier, I know that if I take a lot of risk, I should finance out of equity, not out of debt. Because after all, I still want to do it, fine, it's my problem. So you, as central bankers, after all, maybe you're not equipped to save the world on your own. I wish you were, but maybe it's a bit of a big challenge for you. But you have a mission to preserve financial stability. So you could say, you could argue, and that's certainly something that we at Finance Watch are doing, and in Brussels we're pushing this towards policymakers and legislators, that's actually debated in the European Parliament at the moment, is that if you finance or invest in new fossil fuel reserves, you should fund it out of equity, not out of debt. Proven reserves of oil and gas on the planet are already 7 to 8 times the carbon budget of the planet. So if you explore, dig for more oil and gas, you'll have 10 times, 12 times, 15 times. Great, you're going to lose more money. Even if I'm not interested in the future of the planet, I don't care about my children and my grandchildren. I'm only interested in financial stability tomorrow. Okay, well, that money that I invest will be lost. There is no scenario under which it will not be lost. Therefore, policymaking should be very simple. If you want to explore for more oil, gas, or coal, fund it out of equity. I guess I've exhausted my initial time, but I think we need to reshape our thinking. Here again, I'm sort of concluding where I started by linking science, the way the financial market or finance in general, financial system functions, and the impact on human beings and society. Happy to elaborate further.
Thanks so much, Thierry. It's actually a really good segue. Maybe we go to Elizabeth next, because you mentioned, central banks and regulators clearly have an important role to play in catalyzing change within the financial system, even purely from our own mandate around monetary and financial stability. So Elizabeth, from your perspective, from the ECB's perspective and the SSM's perspective as the supervisor of the largest banks in Europe, perhaps you may tell us a little bit about your priorities in the area of climate change and how you're approaching it.
Thank you, with pleasure. And let me first say my compliments to Central Bank of Ireland for putting this important conference together, and in particular this panel on such an important subject. I just say something personally because Peter's remarks in the beginning really struck me as very, very powerful in terms of their message. I'm a mother of 7 children. We need to wake up and be handling these issues far more quickly, I think, across the globe than we have been. The importance was really outlined very, very brilliantly by Peter. So to the role of the ECB and the supervisory role, I start by saying I'm very proud of what the ECB has been doing. We recognize that governments and parliaments are really the primary actors to fight climate change and promote the green transition, but it's the case that all institutions need to be contributing within their mandate, and that very squarely includes ECB banking supervision, because this is not a matter of social policy or government affairs only, it's a matter of the prudential safety of the institutions. So it is one of the really key priorities that we established for 2022 and 2024. We've set a strategic objective for banks to proactively incorporate risks from climate and environment into their business strategies and their governance and their risk management frameworks. The transition towards a low carbon economy, as well as the physical risks, these present very significant risks to the safety and soundness of our banks. The current energy crisis that we are in the midst of is really a preview for us, and that is showing us what a disorderly transition can look like. And we have these extreme weather events in the hot summer in Europe, which is continuing as we speak, and also extreme weather events in the US. These are reminders of the physical risks ahead. Do you know that when the New York City Marathon will be run on Saturday, it will be 72 degrees Fahrenheit, which is unheard of in November. These developments really highlight how the green transition and the climate change are going to be key sources of volatility and economic shocks in the coming years. And it really reinforces the need that we have to increase the resilience of the financial sector, to the institutions that we supervise, to the climate-related risks. In 2022, we took on several initiatives, and I'll talk a little bit about that in more detail later on. But very briefly, these included a thematic review on climate and environmental risks, a climate risk stress test. It's really one of the very first of its kind by a central bank, a targeted review of banks' commercial real estate exposure to climate risk, as well as several on-site inspections in the institutions. We also conducted a gap analysis of bank disclosures and environmental risks. So we, as supervisors, are making climate and environmental risks really an integral part of our supervisory activities. We are treating them squarely within our mandate, just like any of the other risks that our banks face, and we are expecting the banks really to do the same. Back in 2020, in the height of the pandemic, we set out our climate-related supervisory expectations really very clearly. We did a thematic review. We now have set institution-specific deadlines for achieving full alignment with what our expectations are by the end of 2024. We're being very transparent with the industry about what those expectations are. And while there will certainly be some exceptions in individual cases, we are expecting the institutions to reach, at a minimum, 4 key milestones. The first one is we're expecting the banks to adequately categorize climate and environmental risks and to conduct a full assessment of their impact on the bank's activities by March of 2023 at the latest. We're expecting banks to include climate and environmental risks in their governance, their strategy, their risk management by the end of 2023 at the latest. And here, some banks have already started to plan for the transition to a low carbon economy, and they're starting to engage with their clients, and that's good news. But a wait and see approach is still the prevailing approach in most institutions. And just as an example, we see banks that do not set interim targets or limits to their risk taking with a view to fulfilling their long-term strategic commitments, or even set them in such a way that the immediate impact on banks' business, therefore its prudential safety, is negligible. By the end of 2024, banks are expected to meet all the remaining supervisory expectations on climate and environmental risks that we set forth back in 2020, including full integration into their ICAP planning and their stress testing. Now, we are going to be closely monitoring these deadlines, and we will take enforcement action if they're not being met. And supervisors are already including in their inspections bank-specific climate and environmental findings in the SREP process. That's the supervisory review and evaluation process that all of our institutions are subjected to. And the ECB imposed binding qualitative requirements on more than 30 banks. So we took operational acts in the annual SREP this year. So for a small number of banks, the outcome of the 2022 supervisory exercises on climate and environmental risks had actually an impact on their SREP scores. And banks can expect that to be more the case going forward. So let me just say also something positive. Our supervisory focus on climate risk is already making a difference. And this is where I said at the outset that I'm very proud of what the ECB is doing. We're changing the conversation. While climate risk used to be for our banks something that was considered social policy, government affairs, public affairs issue, and therefore that's where it was housed within the institutions, it's now moved to the risk management function, to the CFO's office, and it's really understood by most banks as an issue of strategic, prudential importance. Climate's made it to the top level in the institutions, and almost all of the banks have given their management bodies responsibilities in these areas. So they're recognizing that this is important for their balance sheet management. I saw a statistic from a UK not-for-profit institution that maybe brings me back to where I started. It's an organization known as Chapter Zero, which focuses on boards. And numbers are always useful in any business. There are 2,625 days and 60 board meetings left to have global emissions and keep the global temperature rise within 1.5 degrees Celsius. We really need to be making this amount of time left that we have count. Thank you.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I think we're all going to keep this fact in our head now because it is it's very good. We might come back to some of the findings of your thematic review as well, because I think that was published very recently and it would be very helpful to get your assessment. But maybe, Stephen, turning to you, I mean, you have quite a, in your role, you have quite a unique vantage point because you can see progress both across countries and also across different financial sectors. So what's your assessment of how we're doing in the kind of financial sphere in meeting some of the challenges we've discussed?
Great, and thank you, Vaz, for having me here today. And Peter, thank you for that inspirational presentation. Scary as well, but it's a great way to keep us all on our toes. And I think, back to Elizabeth's point, I think only a few months ago, a Chapter Zero chapter in Ireland actually was launched with IBEC and a few others. So it's great to see that that's in Ireland as well. In my role within the UNDP, United Nations Development Programme, it's a little bit different because it says it on the tin, development. So we're primarily focused, we're the largest UN agency, 17,000 staff, 160 offices around the country, and around an annual budget around 5 billion, and it's development focused and very much driven under the framework of the Sustainable Development Goals. And Akam Steiner, who's the administrator of the UN, he's number 3 in the UN, that's a UNDP, he's number 3 in the UN, SecGen, Deputy Secretary General, then Akam. And Akam has really been driving out the sustainable finance agenda in the last few years to a point now that UNDP and my colleagues actually provide the Secretariat to the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group. And, again, why would a development agency be in the area of financial services? But, very much recognized by the UNDP, where is the capital? So it's in Europe, it's in other OECD jurisdictions. So we're working with, for example, European Commissioner McGuinness on those type of agendas. And then obviously we're able to bring the SDG framework in as kind of the leaders on that into a lot of these institutions and where are they going. And so that's kind of where I am from the UNDP perspective. I'm very fortunate fast to oversee the Financial Centres for Sustainability, 39 financial centres, the Sustainable Insurance Forum, which includes yourself, which is 37 insurance regulators. And collectively that group regulates 92% of the global insurance market. And then the most recent one is the Asian Pacific Economic Cooperation, 21 finance ministers, Sustainable Finance Development Network, and provide advice into that group. So with an overlap, I'm in around 70 different countries. And I now feel almost like an amateur therapist is the best way to describe my job in the last few years. This has become an overwhelming agenda. And all I do is this, and sometimes I'm afraid to look at LinkedIn or Twitter on a day to see what's the latest initiative, what's the latest acronym, what's the latest report. And so you are dealing with very senior people in ministries of finance and regulators and market actors who are quite, are very intelligent, who are struggling with elements of this agenda. And this is why I think what the ECB is doing is really cutting through a lot of the hot air and saying, this is what you actually need to do, this is the process and when you need it done by. So if I can, not in the same vein as very technical in terms of my colleagues in the panel, but if I can grossly oversimplify it, Vaz, what are some of the challenges we're seeing across those different 70-odd countries? A key one is the lack of talent. And I know the panel before was a lot very much about innovation and fintech and blockchain, and it's not sexy to talk about talent, but that is the key challenge right now. That is actually acting as a handbrake on the whole agenda around sustainable finance. And it's not just within the market, it's also at the policy level. It's at the regulators level. And today, actually, we celebrate 1 year. Last year with President Lagarde and former Governor Carney, we launched the Climate Training Alliance at COP, and that's for regulators, ourselves in the NGFS and CIF and BIS and IIS, because we actually need to upskill the regulators as well. So that's a big challenge right now, a talent agenda. And a few weeks ago, I held the AGM of the financial centres in Casablanca. We had close to 30 financial centres. And what was quite interesting, Vaz and colleagues, was north and south, so perhaps some more sophisticated financial centres, the challenge around talent was actually similar. Now, other financial centres have got the means to actually deal with that quite quickly. If you look at Ireland, Ireland has got the thing called the Sustainable Finance SkillNet. And that's over 1.5 million euros been invested over the last 2 years, Vaz, in upskilling over 2,500 Irish-located finance professionals. I saw Patrick Burke from Irish Life Investment Managers earlier on. Within that 2,500 people, he's upskilled 350 of his staff around this whole area as they look towards the whole net zero agenda. The G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group said that Ireland's Sustainable Finance SkillNet is an exemplar, a global exemplar of a non-financial policy lever to really push on with this agenda. So the first one is talent. The second part, and Thierry referenced it, is data. It's either bad, it's brutal, it's not consistent, you can't compare it. And I can just imagine, Peter, the work that you do in the data points that you're trying to pull out, but that's a big, big challenge. And Thierry's point was, do we actually have time as we try and get access to this data? A lot of the data actually exists within governments. And so how do we pull that out? And Commissioner McGuinness is doing a good job about that. The third one is around that accountability and integrity, or shorthand greenwashing. There's a lot of nonsense going on at the same time in the market in terms of promotion. We're doing this, we're doing that. A lot of commitments were made, especially around COP last year. A lot of different things happening. You saw GFANS and Mary Shapiro and the guys, the Glasgow Financial Net Zero Alliance, I've got the acronym right. Really great initiative. A lot of companies involved in it. Very much trying to make those commitments and be at the fore in the net zero transition. But you've now seen the last week, and it was covered by the FT, that GFANS is moving away from the UN Race to Zero, which is fundamentally science-based targets. And so how can you make a commitment if you're not actually linked it back to the science-based targets? It just doesn't make sense. And so one of the things that we're looking to doing within the integrity accountability piece with the Sustainable Insurance Forum, 37 regulators, is doing an internal analysis of the net zero transition. And how can they as regulators actually get on top of this? And perhaps get ahead of the market and say, this is what we're looking for. And so we're looking forward, we have a meeting on that in Chile this Sunday to discuss. The fourth one is around that policy regulatory convergence. I think Dawn said it earlier on, she talked about Europe, and the Commissioner said it last night as well. This isn't just a European or an Irish challenge, this is a global challenge. And so yes, you've got an element of geopolitical competition, for example, around taxonomies. You've got Europe has got its taxonomy, and perhaps that's been pushed around the world. You've got China, you've got other jurisdictions. But Dr. Ma Jun, who's the co-chair of the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group, I was on a session with him recently, he said there's over 200 taxonomies. So you'd hate to be on the market side trying to figure all this out, because capital is global. And so you're now looking at all these different taxonomies, and obviously Dawn was involved deeply in developing the European taxonomy. So there's a big challenge there, Vaz, about the convergence, recognizing that the capital is global, and that's why actually it's so important what the G20 is doing. The other one then, and it was great to hear Peter bring in biodiversity. And this is really where, and I'm being very blunt, there's been a bit of a meltdown in some of the market actors in the last few months. Biodiversity is really, if you haven't been watching it, has just appeared. But it's been there for a while, and Peter, you've been looking at it, and you and your colleagues, but for a lot of market actors, where has this biodiversity piece come from? And I'm only getting my head around climate, and now you're actually saying biodiversity. And I love the way Peter linked climate change, biodiversity, and society. They're all part of the same challenge. So what are we doing around biodiversity? And then just bringing through kind of a last piece there as well as and again, it's been mentioned by several of our colleagues, that social inequality piece, We're seeing that more and more now. You know, as Europeans, and Elizabeth was saying that I was in Spain a few weeks ago, it was 32 degrees in October. You mentioned the New York Marathon, and that's happening in Europe. But if you look at Africa, you look at these developing countries, you know, you're looking at droughts, you're looking at massive immigration, and migration is driven by the fact that I'm a parent. Elizabeth mentioned she's got 7 kids, I've got 4. We live in the West. Peter mentioned we live in Ireland. We're going to have our challenges, but we live in Ireland, and we can perhaps deal with those challenges with the wealth to deal with it. In a lot of these countries, you don't. And you see, you know, the latest story, a young girl was on a boat across the Mediterranean there a few weeks ago. Her parents are trying to escape the challenges that are happening within their economy. So I think you have to bring this all back down to that there's, as Peter said, there's never been so much capital. I'm sorry, Peter, you didn't say that, but you said there's sufficient capital. There's never been so much capital in the world as we have right now. We know this is a stark challenge. We know what the challenges are. And I have to, you know, say, and it was great to see Commissioner McGuinness today and last night, the European Union is actually taking a lead by creating the framework, but we do need other jurisdictions to play catch-up as well. And America is a big part of that as well. What's going to happen in the next presidential election? Will we see whoever wins that? So I think to kind of sum up what I'm seeing, Vaz, is, and I've grossly oversimplified it from talent down, there's a lot of challenges, but I would argue that the pace of collaboration is picking up significantly. A lot of people are now saying, look, enough time for the hot air and the chat. What does action look like? And then my last point is, I feel that the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, are going to start to take a more prominent role in the coming years in this agenda, because they're measurable, they can be impactful, and perhaps we may move a little bit away from the ESG agenda into the SDGs, but that's going to be an evolution.
It's great. Thanks, Stephen. Hopefully we'll have a little bit of time to go into some of these issues in a bit more depth, whether it's, you know, biodiversity or skills or international coordination, because these are themes that emerge in a lot of these conversations. Maybe just Peter, having heard everyone else, I mean, one of the points that is coming across, and I think Thierry made it really well, is the importance of linking, well, how multidisciplinary this is basically, and linking science with kind of economics and regulation. How can we make this collaboration most effective? How do we bring this multidisciplinary perspective?
That's a very challenging question, because it's about talking, we can say the same word, but it can mean very different things across different disciplines. So we're often talking at cross purposes from one another. We need to create the safe spaces and the mechanisms that bring people together. The central bank, for example, has started a group on climate, which brings together people who might be able to work together in this space. Those kind of enabling conditions need to happen. The funding for experts to come together needs to happen. But reflecting upon what my co-panelists have said, it's notable that a lot of it is high level. And where's the immediate enabling conditions for people, society, to participate in this? The government provide costs for the very poor, and they must. We provide grants for that are accessible to the very rich, but that increases inequity. Where is the equitable and just transition? Where is the effort within the financial sector to enable the middle, which is the bulk of society, to participate in the transition? And I'll just give a very facile example of the perversities in the system that currently exists. So we bought our electric car in 2019. We availed of the government's grant and VRT reduction, but the car dealership was offering 0% finance on all, and I mean all, of the new petrol and diesel cars, and a 5% finance on the electric car. We went and found a slightly cheaper one, but it was still, we could not avail of the 0% finance. So the aspects of the financial system, our continued support for fossil fuels, and aspects of not supporting the greener alternative over the other are really quite striking. So how can we use the financial system to steer people to make decisions? And I don't think we've remotely grappled with that yet.
Very good. I'm already getting some questions, by the way, but maybe just 2 or 3 more, maybe on where we are right now in some of these dimensions. So, I mean, Elizabeth, I wonder if there's this question of what's our current assessment of the financial system's ability to identify, measure, and manage these climate-related risks. You mentioned you just concluded your thematic review on this. So I wonder if you can give us your headline insights on where we are at the moment.
With pleasure. I'll give you the punchline first. The short answer is that the glass is no longer empty. We're moving the needle, but it is definitely not yet half full. Banks are starting to make progress to incorporate the climate and the environmental risks in their strategy, in their governance, in their risk management frameworks, but for sure, we have a long road ahead of us, and there's a lot more that needs to be done. This year, we did two things. We did a climate risk stress test, and we did a thematic review. And I'd like to just tell you briefly about both of those because it really gives us some insight into what's happening with the institutions. So with the climate risk stress test, we assess the institutions to understand their capabilities in different scenarios, what their reliance on carbon-emitting sectors are, and whether or not they're including stress test projections for transition and for physical risks in front of them. For us, as well as for the institutions, this was really a learning exercise. It wasn't a pass-fail that we put in front of the institutions, and unlike other stress tests that we run, we were not anticipating any capital impact, and we didn't produce a capital impact out of the climate risk stress test. The exercise showed overall banks are not sufficiently reflecting climate risk in their stress test frameworks. More than half of the institutions lacked a climate risk stress test framework completely. We're also finding that banks are relying significantly on carbon-emitting sectors. More than half the income from non-financial corporate customers has its origin in greenhouse gas intensive industries, and that is making the banks that we supervise more vulnerable to transition risks. And here, there's a particular thing. Banks are relying, instead of on actual energy performance certificates when they're doing their financings and their lending, they're relying on proxies. And this is an easy one. They need to change this practice and be gathering actual, accurate, climate-relevant counterparty data. It's like an appraisal in a mortgage. So this is an easy one for them to undertake. And in terms of physical risk, we did a bottom-up stress test, and it showed that the vulnerabilities highly depend on the geographic location of the exposures that the bank has entered into. And that's going to be important for them to understand and for them to manage. So also there's breaking news in front of you the day after we published the results of the thematic review. And the results are showing that despite improvements, banks still need to better identify and manage climate and environmental risks. And at the same time, we also published, and this is important, a compendium of good practices that we saw in the banks, because it shows that where there are good practices, it's possible to make swift progress. And we think it's not enough to just say these are the deficiencies. We want institutions to be emulating some of the good practices that we showed. So we assessed 186 banks with 25 trillion in total assets in this thematic review. There were also 79 of what are known as the less significant institutions, so not just the largest banks across Europe. And the results showed that there's been improvement. As I said, there's the glass is beginning to be filled. They've improved their capabilities since 2021 when we asked them to do that assessment. 85% of them now have in place at least some basic practices. But there's clear gaps in all the areas of focus that we put forth in the guide that we published, and individual banks themselves are not making progress really across the board. So banks need more sophisticated methodologies. They need more granular information on their climate and their environmental risks. We're seeing a lot of use of blunt instruments, and that has got to get refined. We're seeing that banks are significantly underestimating the breadth and the magnitude of the risks that are in front of them. And this statistic should be something that gives us pause. Virtually all of the banks, 96% of them, have blind spots in identifying these risks. There are also significant gaps in how comprehensively the banks address climate and environmental risks. For example, a bank may look at flood risk for its mortgages, but it may omit completely looking at droughts for its large agriculture portfolio, or omit looking at the impact of a CO2 price for its large energy clients. So, there are things that can be done there. And we also have supervisory concerns coming out of the thematic review about the execution capabilities of the institutions, because in a number of cases, they did devise practices, but then they failed to implement them effectively. And these will have serious repercussions on balance sheets, especially if institutions are publicly making green claims. We sent letters out to all the banks identifying the shortcomings, and we expect that banks will be taking decisive action to address these, as my colleague just was saying. Action is what we need here. So the good practices, they're coming from all walks of life, big, small, local, international, specialized, so that's good news. We've seen banks using transition planning tools. They're using scientific pathways to assess the portfolio's alignment with the Paris Agreement, and they're setting concrete intermediate targets. So banks with good practices are engaging with their clients, and they're taking very client-specific actions to move things forward. So that's the picture from this year.
Thanks very much. Maybe one more question, then we'll move on, because we don't have that much time. But I'm interested a little bit in the non-financial sector as well, because a lot of this is about capital flowing to the non-financial sector to support the transition. Is the non-financial sector ready? Is it prepared? What role can the financial system play in catalyzing change? What role can the taxonomy play in that? I don't know if anyone has any kind of specific thoughts, or either Thierry or Don, or both of you here.
If I could say, first of all, as I listened to Elizabeth talking about, say, some of the deficiencies, I wonder, a large part of me wonders, is that to do with the lack of good quality comparable data that the real economy sector is disseminating? And I think it could very well be. It's one of the parts of the puzzle of solutions, because at the moment we have real economy actors who are, some of them falling under the NFRD requirements, the Non-Financial Reporting Directive, but many may not have particular disclosure requirements. So the information that we're getting through into the system that the banks and the other financial institutions gather is patchy, and even with the EU taxonomy, there is a tool. I work, reviewing data on EU taxonomy, eligibility and alignment, the consistency, the comparability. There are some really good reporters, but there are still a lot of data gaps, and I think that the real economy sector wants to enhance the investments and the profile of their businesses, show that their business models are strategically sustainable, that they're evaluating their own risks and opportunities, and they want to disseminate that so that the financial sector can use that information to better their performance.
Thanks. I think, Stephen, you want to come in, and Thierry as well?
Yes, as you wish.
So I suppose, again, the meeting we had at financial centres there recently, I've focused on the European one. One of the big things they were asking us was, how can you help us around the SME sector? So this is a big challenge right now, and as Dawn said, and Elizabeth highlighted it. But again, if you zero down into Ireland, you've had Brexit, you've had a pandemic, you're a small business trying to keep yourself afloat. There's been a lot going on, but that isn't an excuse per se. But it kind of shows you what can happen very quickly if you're not on top of this from a risk perspective. But what you're also seeing, Vaz, in Ireland, a lot of the government incentives around skills or vouchers to whatever you may do around climate, they're not being taken up by the SMEs to the degree that people thought they would be. So, I think part of the challenge that goes back to what Elizabeth is saying there is, your bank manager is now going to sit down with you and say, look, we won't be able to do this anymore in the next 2-3 years, because our regulator, yourself, or ECB, are now saying, from a fact-based perspective, within this climate scenario analysis, et cetera, you're now going to be a risk to us. So what we're seeing in a domestic perspective, I find very interesting, is that the financial institutions are now trying to figure out ways to support their clients and actually create programs with money behind them to either upskill or whatever that the support may be. And I really feel into next year, Vaz, that's going to pick up considerably. And I'm quite excited about that. And wouldn't it be great if Ireland could become an exemplar of how you work with the SME sector, that non-financial, and that could potentially be rolled out across Europe. But as Dawn said, there's a lot behind it, and you're an SME trying to stay afloat. Yeah. How do you get your head around that? And potentially lack of access to capital in future is a flash in red light for you. Sorry, Thierry.
Yes, thank you very much. If I may add, I think, yes, of course, you need a huge involvement of the non-financial sector, because at the end of the day, the objective is not to decarbonize financial portfolios. The objective is to decarbonize the world. That's what we're aiming for. So, how do you achieve that? Well, perhaps the way to achieve that is to follow the line or direction shown by a recent proposal made by the European Commission in the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. So, sorry, I'm being technical here, Article 15, that says that non-financial companies should have a transition plan towards net zero. Okay, right direction. Well done, European Commission. But it needs to be made more precise, more rigorous. Because if you just say, hey, have a transition plan, then it's going to be vague and you don't know what's going to happen. So, right direction, but as the proposal is on the table of the co-legislators today, we certainly push for two things to add to this article. One is use the European taxonomy of sustainable activities as a tool to measure what sustainability means. Because very often we hear a criticism of the taxonomy saying, hey, it's all very well, but there's like 2, 3, or 4% of the European economy that is actually aligned with the taxonomy today, which is not a surprise. The world is not stable. It's not only in Europe, it's everywhere. So yes, of course, not aligned. Proves that taxonomy is not as bad as some people say. It's good measurement. It needs to be used as a transition tool, not a tool to make photo of what is sustainable today. So if you link those transition plans saying, okay, non-financial company XYZ, has a plan to reach net zero in 2050, but there are intermediary steps, and I will reach the sustainable threshold defined by the taxonomy for my field of activity on that date, and then you follow. And then you link it back to financiers, which is either you're investing as an equity holder or you're lending money. If you're a shareholder, well, that's called shareholder engagement. Go to AGMs, engage with companies. Say, hey, you have a transition plan. Can we talk about it? Are you actually doing it? If you're lending money, either as a bondholder or as a bank, if you call yourself green, sustainable, ESG, you name it, those are very often more or less equivalent. There's many ways of saying it. Well, prove to me that you provided the finance you provided to the company with a provision that that company will enter a transition pathway. And if you do that, then you resolve also, in passing, the problem of greenwashing. You, as a financier, you're not doing greenwashing if you provide capital by linking the capital you provide to the fact that the non-financial company, has an actual plan, and not only has a plan, but is implementing it. So that's really what we need to do. And by the way, that's easy to do. I mean, it's easy to write in the regulation, in the legislation, and then we just do it. And we're lucky, and we had Commissioner McGuinness this morning, in Europe to have, a positive momentum on that side. And I know, I'm a member of the Platform Sustainable Finance, which is the successor of the TEG. And I know the European Commission is looking for, clever uses of the taxonomy, which is normal. You need to use that formidable tool that was invented and now exists. Well, transition is one of those applications that could be very, very useful for the taxonomy and for society in general.
Can I add there as well? One of the challenges that the non-financial sector is grappling with is connecting their financial KPIs to their sustainable activities. And it's something that they really need to get, I suppose, further help with, is making that connection so that the financial sector can understand their CapEx, their OpEx, and their revenue, and the percentage that is taxonomy eligible and aligned. So there are challenges around that, but certainly on the transition, it's definitely a tool on that.
Excellent, thank you. We knew we were going to run out of time, but just check if there are kind of questions from the room. I have one. Okay, we have at least at least three. So maybe let me give you one from from the online audience. Maybe collect a few of them and you can cover them collectively. So from kind of the audience online, one question related to the fireside discussion this morning around trust and how concerned are panel members around greenwashing. If investors don't trust the green credentials, how will we transition to sustainable finance? And maybe if we could take 2 or 3, and I might ask all of you to kind of give any final words covering some of these questions, if that's okay, because I think we're being shown cards already.
Thanks, guys, for the great insight. So my question is coming from, I think, as soon as we have kind of simplified our world, using technology a lot, so we have become lazy as well. So as I think, Pete, your research mentioned, the photovoltaic, the evolution and everything, we are still lagging because we live in Ireland and the weather is not supporting that much in terms of that, efficiency of how much we can generate from solar, in terms of efficiency. And then another on the infrastructure on the, electric cars and stuff. We don't have the roads and everything at the moment in terms of infrastructure that we can improve that particular thing. So I'm coming from, National Authority of Ireland recently, they put across a lot of, emphasis on green fossil fuels in their all transport lines and everything. So on a day-to-day basis, we are doing a lot of work from institution basis, regulator basis. So on an individual basis, how we can, contribute that part. In terms of, if we kind of, avoid driving as much we can, in terms of taking public transport and stuff so that we can avoid, all these fossil fuels emissions. And we have lot of targets to, fulfill in terms of EU transition and everything. So I will be looking forward for all those particular, inputs as an individual basis, because when we were all in university, we used to bike a lot, so everything used to be environment friendly and everything. So, but because as soon as the technology grows and the life comfort grows, people are very less willing to move back to that life, so how we can take that particular thing on an individual basis, because it's just coming from the point, we have in Tesco, the tagline, every little helps. So that's why I'm kind of looking forward for the thoughts. Thanks.
Thank you. Maybe we take one more and then we go back to our panelists. Yeah.
Thank you. It's John Cronin here at Goodbody. A couple of ones on relating it back to the credit institutions, actually. And look, in view of the ECB's thematic review yesterday, curious around how I suppose the findings and working through the findings that come mid to late 23 and at the end of 24, in terms of the ECB's work with the banking sector, what kind of incentives will be imposed in terms of ensuring that the banking system does indeed up its game, and we do see stark differences between individual institutions already. And I suppose the question is in relation to how capital requirements could evolve. How substantive could this be in terms of impact on SREP levels, for example? Is it just a kind of a 20 basis points tweak or something bigger? And then in an interrelated context, we've not seen any benefits accruing to banks who are lending significantly or engaging in significant green lending, for example. Is that because of definitional issues and a lot of work that needs to be done in order to determine suitability for lower risk weights, or should we be thinking about the inverse in terms of potential inflation for non-green lending? Thanks.
Okay, thanks very much. We have, I think, about 2 to 5 minutes. So maybe any kind of final words through kind of 3 broad areas: greenwashing, individual behavior, and some of the kind of issues from and incentives for banks. And any kind of quick final words from anyone. Perhaps we start, Elizabeth, with you, just because you're kind of further on that side where we are.
You're muted.
Sorry, yeah, we can't hear you, Elizabeth.
I'll be very brief. I'll just comment quickly on concern about greenwashing. I think this is a significant concern. We have to be able to trust the processes. We have to be able to rely on appropriate disclosures and appropriate categorizations. I think the taxonomy issue is a real one. We need to get more harmonization across the different markets with respect to the taxonomy so that we can have clarity about what is a green asset and how that is set up. And there's been a lot of learning in this area. There needs to be, I think, a think about the definitions and more harmonization and more specificity. On the SREP levels, I wouldn't want to predict what exact capital impacts there would be. But I would say I have a general philosophy that the tools that we have available to us are far broader than just a capital impact in the SREP methodology. And I think we need to be making full use of those tools, meaning that what we want is for banks to be changing their processes, to be understanding the risks, to be understanding how to manage, how to assess, how to measure, how to manage, and how to assess the risk that's in their portfolio, and to be working closely with their clients. There are a number of tools at our disposal to ensure that practices that support those things and good risk management get put in place. There's also the capital tool, and I think that's one of the sharpest swords that we have. For sure, if we see that institutions are not evaluating appropriately, we will be evaluating a capital impact down the road. But we've been very clear that for now, no capital impact, and instead practices need to be changed, and we can take enforcement against institutions that are not moving in that direction.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Stephen?
I won't get into the detail. I just think that the point of the individual, what are you doing? Look, during COVID, a new train station opened by us. It's increased the value of the home, which is great. I wasn't doing it from a green perspective. I just realized once I started using it, going, wow, this is incredible. I need to be able to advertisement saying that this is used public transport. I've got rid of the second car. Because of supply chain issues, we got paid a lot more for the second-hand car because there was challenges in the marketplace. And I was able to come across today from Castleknock to here via the DART and the Maynooth train, and it was kind of fantastic for me at an individual level that I'm now actually living what I'm talking about, but it wasn't a grand plan. And if you look at the challenge then is that not everybody has access to that. And that's the big challenge, right? If we all had access to it, great. We now want to have 1 million EV cars on the road by whatever year. Peter, you were mentioning some of the stuff with geopolitics. Where's the rare earth materials? The Chinese got a lot of them sewn up. So this is some of the challenges, but that's what I'll just say from an individual perspective.
Thanks very much. Thierry?
Very briefly on greenwashing, which is a big topic. When it comes to the financial sector, there are two conceptions of greenwashing. One is the financial sector doing what it says it is doing? And the other conception is what it is doing impactful? Does it make a difference? It's very important when we discuss this greenwashing that we make that distinction. Supervisors, regulators are well equipped, whether market supervisors or bank or insurance supervisors, they're well equipped to do the first check, i.e., are you doing what you're saying you're doing? Which is really extremely important. When it comes to the second conception of greenwashing, is it impactful? It's much more complex, it's much more delicate. Nothing is not feasible, and if you link it to what I was saying earlier, i.e. if financial call itself, green, perhaps the supervisor could check that it is doing something that has been predefined as impactful. So I'll stop here because we should organize a full day conference just on this topic. But I think for the sake of being efficient in our discussions, we really must distinguish between those two conceptions and push them gradually. Not, there's no miracle, but have a very clear mind about this.
Thank you. Dawn and final words.
I'm going to try and tackle the three questions, starting with actually the incentives, because Commissioner McGuinness today said that money matters, but I would also say money concentrates the mind. And if the financial sector institutions see a real benefit, they will embed the practices and the good practices into their operations. And I think a green asset ratio that gives some incentive, which they then pass on to their own customers, I think that's a full life cycle of benefit. So I do support that. When we talk about greenwashing, I would say, having chaired the EFRAG report on sustainability-related risks and opportunities and linkage to the business model, greenwashing was one of the topics we tackled, and we did a survey. It's so high on everyone's agenda. The accountants and the auditors had more to say about it than the academics, if I might might say, and very, very high knowledge around what greenwashing is, and very passionate responses we received. So I want to take the other conversation. We have the rules and the obligations, and we have the sanctions. They're a must. Without the regulatory requirements, this agenda won't move. But for a lot of institutions and non-financial companies, they're starting on a journey, and they're afraid of being perceived as greenwashing. This might mean that they suppress some of the, the actions that they might take or the reporting that they might do because they are afraid. So we just want to bear that in mind. How do we get that balance between not suffocating change by saying, if you make a wrong step here, you're going to be a greenwasher, and you could have sanctions, and you could have your reputation ruined. So we want to make sure that there's a trust, and that's what we were talking about for the last 2 days. That trust goes with all of this agenda as well. And then on your individual, I think you made some very good comments there. The government has a big role to play here, because that's where citizens interact. We are employees of businesses. Yes, we're consumers of financial products, but our government is ultimately setting the targets for our clean mobility, our housing, and I would say to you, the one thing you can do is seek the politician who talks truly about green and is not greenwashing, and vote for them, because that is the strongest step you can make overall in your personal journey to green your family life and your personal life and your working life.
Thank you. Peter, we started with the science. Let's finish with the science.
Well, I was going to actually answer the individual question. So with my personal experience, so I'm lucky enough to be able to own an A2 rated house, 5 kilowatt solar array, solar hot water, 2 electric cars. What cost of living crisis? For 2 months during the summer, my electricity bill was €300. That's for 2 months of driving, probably 5,000–6,000 kilometers, cooking, heating my water, using electricity for absolutely everything. I live in Edenderry, hardly known for the sun. So it's entirely possible for decisions that we make to make sense. I did not know there would be a war in Ukraine and there would be a fossil fuel and cost of energy crisis that's energy driven. I'm very, very fortunate in that choice, but it is ultimately the combination of individual choices, in my case driven by my need to live what I espouse.
Very good. Thanks very much to all of you. Really, really great discussion, and I think we covered like maybe 10% of what we were hoping to, but thanks very much also to everyone for your question and participation. Yeah, very good.